Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we uncover the shocking story of a wife, a priest, and a murder that changed everything. Miriam Davenport was the epitome of wealth and sophistication, a woman whose life seemed perfect from the outside. Married to Richard Davenport, a successful entrepreneur, she lived in a sprawling mansion nestled in an exclusive neighborhood, attended lavish galas, and was a prominent figure in her affluent community. To most, she had everything anyone could desire: beauty, status, and unshakable security. Yet beneath the polished exterior, Miriam's life felt hollow. Her marriage, once filled with passion and promise, had grown cold over the years. Richard's focus on his business empire left little room for emotional connection. Their conversations became transactional, their interactions distant, and Miriam often found herself retreating to the quiet corners of their home, overwhelmed by loneliness. She yearned for something deeper, something that could reignite the fire within her that life's luxuries could never satisfy. It was during this vulnerable period that Miriam encountered Father Samuel Quinn, a charismatic priest who had recently been appointed to their parish. Initially, Miriam approached Samuel for spiritual guidance. Their conversations were formal, centered on faith and her struggles within her marriage. Yet, as their meetings became more frequent, the boundaries between priest and parishioner began to blur. Samuel's quiet intensity drew Miriam in, while her beauty and vulnerability awakened emotions in him that he had sworn to suppress. What began as innocent discussions evolved into something far more dangerous. Miriam started finding excuses to visit the church outside of regular services, often lingering after everyone else had left. Samuel, though conflicted, found himself anticipating her visits, his heart betraying his vows. Their connection deepened in secret, with both of them justifying their actions as something beyond their control. The clandestine nature of their relationship added to its allure. They met in secluded places, their stolen moments filled with passion and guilt. For Miriam, Samuel was the antidote to the emptiness she had felt for so long. For Samuel, Miriam represented a forbidden temptation that he could not resist. As their romance flourished in the shadows, neither Miriam nor Samuel considered the consequences. They believed their secret was safe, hidden behind the veneer of their respective roles. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of unraveling, and theirs was no exception. Their affair would set in motion a chain of events that neither could foresee, changing their lives forever. Richard Davenport, a man known for his sharp instincts and calculated demeanor, began to sense that something was amiss in his marriage. Miriam's behavior had shifted in ways he couldn't ignore. Her once predictable routines were now peppered with unexplained absences and vague excuses. She seemed distracted during conversations, often lost in thought, and her usual warmth toward him had cooled noticeably. What concerned Richard the most was her newfound interest in church activities, something she had never been particularly devoted to before. He initially dismissed these changes as a phase, perhaps a reaction to the strain of their increasingly distant relationship. However, as time went on, Richard's suspicions grew. His business acumen had trained him to recognize when something didn't add up, and Miriam's actions were beginning to form a pattern he couldn't ignore. Refusing to confront her directly without evidence, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Richard hired a private investigator to uncover the truth. He was determined to learn whether Miriam's behavior was merely a sign of personal struggle or if something more sinister was unfolding. The investigator discreetly followed Miriam, documenting her movements and interactions. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The investigator presented Richard with a series of photographs that confirmed his worst fears. The images showed Miriam meeting with Father Samuel Quinn in secluded locations, far from the prying eyes of their community. Their body language left little doubt about the nature of their relationship. The discovery left Richard seething, but he maintained his composure. Rather than confronting Miriam immediately, he decided to use the information to his advantage, plotting his next move with the precision of a chess master. Meanwhile, Miriam and Samuel's affair grew increasingly intense. The secrecy and danger only seemed to heighten their passion. They began taking greater risks, meeting more frequently and in less secure locations. Miriam, blinded by her emotions, failed to notice Richard's growing distance and the subtle shifts in his behavior. Samuel, too, underestimated the dangers of their actions, believing that their connection could remain hidden. Richard's silence was not a sign of ignorance but of strategy. He watched Miriam closely, feigning indifference while carefully piecing together the details of her betrayal. Every glance, every whispered phone call, and every late-night departure became ammunition in his mind. Miriam and Samuel believed they were operating in the shadows, but Richard was already orchestrating a plan that would bring their affair into the light. His silence was the calm before the storm, and neither Miriam nor Samuel had any idea of the reckoning that awaited them. Richard's patience finally reached its breaking point on a quiet evening when Miriam left their mansion under the pretense of attending a charity event. Her lies had become predictable, and Richard knew exactly where she was going. Armed with the information provided by the private investigator, he followed her car down winding roads until it came to a stop at a remote cabin hidden deep in the woods. This was their secret meeting place, the one where Miriam and Father Samuel Quinn believed they were safe from the prying eyes of the world. Richard parked a short distance away, his mind racing with fury and betrayal. As he approached the cabin, the faint glow of light through the curtains revealed silhouettes inside. Miriam and Samuel, oblivious to the danger, were locked in a tender moment, their connection palpable even from the outside. Richard's anger boiled over, and he stormed through the door without hesitation. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Richard's voice thundered through the small cabin, accusing Miriam of destroying their marriage and dragging their family name through the mud. Miriam was caught off guard, her face a mix of fear and defiance. Samuel, torn between guilt and the need to protect Miriam, stepped forward in an attempt to calm Richard, but his intervention only fueled the flames. Richard's rage was relentless, his accusations cutting through the tense air like a knife. He berated Samuel, calling him a fraud who had betrayed his sacred vows. Samuel stood his ground, trying to explain, but his words only deepened Richard's anger. The tension in the room became unbearable, the emotions spiraling toward an inevitable breaking point. What happened next would haunt everyone involved. As the argument escalated, Richard reached into his coat and produced a handgun. The sight of the weapon froze Miriam and Samuel in place. Miriam pleaded with Richard to put the gun down, her voice trembling, but he was beyond reason. In the chaos, a single gunshot rang out, echoing through the quiet night. The sound was deafening, and the aftermath was silent, save for Miriam's panicked breaths. Samuel lay on the floor, a bullet wound in his chest, his life slipping away. Miriam knelt beside him, her hands stained with blood, as tears streamed down her face. Richard stood motionless, his expression eerily calm as if the act had drained him of all emotion. When the police arrived, summoned by a neighbor who had heard the commotion, they found Miriam still crouched over Samuel's body. Richard offered no resistance, his chilling calm unbroken. The night had ended in tragedy, and the murder of Father Samuel Quinn and the circumstances surrounding it became a media sensation almost overnight. The details of Miriam Davenport's affair with the priest. Miriam was charged with murder and claimed self-defense from the outset. Richard, in contrast, presented himself as the wronged party, a husband pushed to his limits by his wife's betrayal. He accused Miriam of manipulating Father Samuel into an affair and orchestrating the murder to rid herself of Richard entirely. His calm and composed demeanor in court contrasted sharply with Miriam's emotional testimony, and his legal team worked tirelessly to frame her as a cunning and heartless woman. The prosecution faced the daunting task of piecing together a coherent narrative from a chaotic crime scene. Forensic evidence introduced early in the trial raised questions about Miriam's account. The trajectory of the bullet suggested it had been fired from a standing position, not from someone acting in desperation on the ground as Miriam had claimed. Furthermore, the fingerprints on the gun were inconsistent with a sudden struggle. These inconsistencies cast doubt on her version of events and gave weight to Richard's claims of a premeditated act. As the trial unfolded, the defense introduced evidence of Richard's meticulous nature, portraying him as someone capable of orchestrating a scenario to implicate Miriam. They pointed to the private investigator he had hired, arguing that Richard had been laying the groundwork for revenge long before the fatal night. The defense painted him as a man who had not only discovered the affair but had carefully planned his response, ensuring that Miriam would take the blame. Despite these arguments, Miriam's credibility began to erode under the scrutiny of cross-examination. Her emotional outbursts and inconsistencies in her testimony fueled the prosecution's case. Public opinion shifted almost daily as sensational headlines emerged, with both sides revealing shocking details that kept the jury and the world on edge. The truth seemed elusive, buried beneath layers of conflicting testimonies and damning evidence. The case became a labyrinth of lies, leaving everyone wondering whether Miriam was a victim fighting for her life or a cunning killer trying to escape justice. As the trial neared its conclusion, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. Both sides had presented compelling cases, and the jury was tasked with untangling a web of deceit, passion, and violence. Miriam maintained her innocence, insisting that she had acted in self-defense to protect herself and Father Samuel from Richard's uncontrollable rage. Richard, on the other hand, doubled down on his narrative, portraying himself as the victim of Miriam's betrayal and manipulation. Just as the case seemed to be heading toward a stalemate, a shocking development changed everything. The private investigator Richard had hired, the very one who had uncovered Miriam's affair, came forward with new evidence. He revealed that he had installed a hidden camera near the cabin, intending to capture Miriam's movements for further proof of infidelity. What the camera recorded on the night of Samuel's murder would prove pivotal. The footage, shown to a stunned courtroom, revealed the dramatic confrontation between Richard, Miriam, and Samuel. It showed Richard entering the cabin and engaging in a heated argument with the pair. While the video had no audio, the body language and gestures were clear Richard was the aggressor. Then came the moment that silenced the entire courtroom. The camera captured Richard pulling a gun from his coat and pointing it at Samuel, who raised his hands in an apparent attempt to de-escalate the situation. Without hesitation, Richard fired the fatal shot, striking Samuel in the chest. Miriam's reaction in the footage was one of shock and horror. She rushed to Samuel's side, attempting to stop the bleeding as Richard stood over them, his expression cold and devoid of remorse. The footage directly contradicted Richard's claims that Miriam had been the one to pull the trigger and shattered his credibility. The jury, now presented with irrefutable evidence, deliberated for only a few hours before delivering their verdict. Richard was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The calculated nature of his actions, combined with his attempt to frame Miriam, ensured that the punishment was severe. Miriam, while exonerated of the crime, was left to grapple with the profound fallout of her choices. Though the court declared her innocent of murder, her affair with Father Samuel and the scandal it ignited left her reputation in ruins. Shunned by her community and estranged from the world she once knew, she chose to leave her old life behind, moving to a quiet town where no one knew her name. The story of Miriam Davenport and Father Samuel Quinn became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of how passion, betrayal, and jealousy can intertwine to create a chain of events that ends in devastation. The legacy of that fateful night lingered in whispers, a chilling example of how love and vengeance can spiral into darkness.